I'm back. This one is going to be called the Kevin Samuels syndrome. And I thought I would address this one because even though he's deceased now, there are a lot of videos made about him. Um, well, they've basically taken excerpts off of his videos to make more money off of his videos, even though he's gone. Evidently, that's legal since they're still doing it. But anyway, um, what I wanted to talk about was the effect that he had on a lot of men and women, a lot of black men and women that listened to him. And some of the things that I feel like that he didn't cover when he was doing his show that I think really needs to be brought up. And first off, let me say, unlike him, I am married. I've been married for 23 years. I've been with my wife for 24 years. And I've been married before. I've been married and divorced. So I've done the same thing he's done. I was married twice before. And this is my third marriage. But this time I got it right. And so I actually put into practice the things that I'm going to be talking about. They're not theory. I don't have statistics because I've told you in the other videos that I have about how I feel about statistics and how those things are arrived at. They're not always, the critical thinking has to go in to those statistics. You just can't take the raw numbers because it's not that simple. So anyway, one of the things that he talks about, and let me get this one, let me put this one out here first. As far as the women that would come on the show and he would tell them, you know, that they basically blew it because they didn't get married by a certain period of time and now no man's going to want them and things of that nature. He did the same thing that he accused a lot of women of. He basically generalized on something that in many cases it would be a case by case basis. In other words, what he said would happen to all those women is not necessarily going to happen to all those women, that they're going to have to die alone, buy a dog and die alone. When me and my wife got together, we were both 44 years old. She'd been married once, I'd been married twice. We basically had been through it, both of us. We both had high body counts because by the time you get to be that age, unless you're in a monastery somewhere or unless something's really wrong with you, you've had plenty of experience. So we both had body counts. And I'm not a hypocrite. So I didn't hold that against my wife. You know, obviously I would have loved to have had a virgin if I could have had one. As a matter of fact, there were two virgins I was going to marry. The first one was my high school sweetheart when I was in my teens. And I know she was a virgin because I actually broke her in. And the other one was, she wasn't a virgin, but she was only 19 years old and she didn't have any children. And she hadn't, in my opinion, she hadn't been out there long enough to have a high body count. But other than that, no. I mean, anybody else I would meet, most of them, by the time I would meet them, they have at least one child. And if not more, some by multiple, you know, different daddies, baby daddies, as they say. And that's just the way of the world. And nobody's perfect. I made mistakes. Those women made their mistakes. We've all made mistakes. Some of us don't make those mistakes, but it's it's not so much because of the fact that we're so much that those people are better than we are, as much as it is that they they just did it right the first time. And there's no magic formula for that. My brother, my middle brother, he did it right the first time. He married his high school sweetheart, never got a divorce, and they stayed married for, I think they were married for over 50 years before he died. My father did the same thing. He married my mother. They were only married, they was high school sweethearts, never divorced, never separated. They were married for over 55 years before he died. So sometimes people get it right the first time. Everybody doesn't get it right the first time. And there are all kind of different reasons why they don't. And when it comes to the women, this is a defense of the women, and it's not an excuse. But as I've often said, a lot of times there's a difference between an excuse and a reason. But the reasons and the why does matter. And I know that, and I had done a series about this too. That was the first series I ever did, was when they were talking about welfare destroying the black family. I reject that premise for several different reasons. If you ever want to find out what those reasons are, you can go back and look at my series. But long story short, I think it was really more so the birth control pill that affected the black community more so than anything, because it's just like the old saying. They said when the white community gets a cold, the black community gets pneumonia. In other words, anything that affects them tends to affect us more. And a lot of times the reason why it does is not just because of discrimination or racism, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that we're trying to follow them down a path and we don't know what we're doing. We're just following them. In other words, a lot of times we look at the optics, but the substance beneath the optics are the things that we're not so keen on, that we're not so fast to catch on to that. And the same thing goes with the feminist movement. When the feminist movement rolled around and white women started claiming their independence, black women followed them into that mindset because they wanted to be independent too. And women, just like men, tend to compete with their counterparts. And so they just didn't want the white women to be able to enjoy things that they could enjoy. So when the birth control pill came around, and the main thing about the birth control pill was women for the first time had sexual freedom that they never had before. Prior to the birth control pill, you either had the condom. They did have creams and foam back during that time, I think. I'm not sure, but the IUD may have preceded the birth control pill, but I'm not going to swear by that. But they did have other forms of birth control. And they also had, of course, men had condoms, but they also had the rhythm method. And when my mother and father's generation was coming up, since they didn't have all those contraceptives, a lot of what they used was what they call the rhythm method, when they, second guessed the woman's ovulation period and tried to get all the sex in around that time, hoping that they weren't going to have sex when she was ovulating, and then that way she wouldn't get pregnant. And that was a hit or miss, to put it lightly. That's the reason why families were so much bigger prior to the birth control pill. So it wasn't anything for people to have 10, 12 kids in the same family. That wasn't unusual at all because there was no birth control. And if they didn't wait, a lot of them had midwives, they had their children at home. The women didn't have D&Cs to clean them out. So if they didn't wait that 6-week period, and probably a lot of them didn't, and the man, being deprived for as long as he was, jumped right back in it, and the woman might have been a little horny too, then, that's the reason why kids a lot of times were born back to back to back to back. But when the birth control pill came around, that changed that. That gave women the option that they never had before. And that was during the era prior to when I was growing up. I don't know. I have not researched yet exactly when the birth control pill came out, but it was in full effect when I was a teenager and had been for a long time. So along those lines, it was for the first time women could start making decisions that they never made before, which were superficial decisions as far as relationships was concerned. Also around that time, at least around the time that I was coming up, like I said, not before, but during that time when and I was a teenager through the 70s. Around that time was when Superfly and the Mac first came out. Shaft came out, but the Superfly and the Mac came out. And the Superfly and the Mac affected the black community more so than the Shaft movie did. There weren't anybody really trying to be a black Private Eye. I guess they thought that was a bridge too far. But the Superfly and the Mac, you would not believe how many grown ass men were straightening their hair like the Mac. And Superfly, especially Superfly, because he had the hair was really laid down, and dressing like them and putting the kits on the front of the Eldorados and cutting a diamond in the back. I mean, it was ridiculous. They were trying their best to look like the Mac and Superfly. And women were going for it. The black women were going for that. And it blew my mind. I'm a teenager. I'm looking at this. I'm not even old enough to drive, but I'm still looking at it. I'd seen the movies. I knew about I bought the soundtracks, loved the soundtracks. Curtis Mayfield, Superfly, the whole nine. And I'm talking about the original Superfly, not what they got out now. And so anyway, but I was really mesmerized by the fact that these women, that the black women were they were going for it, and because me and some of the guys I grew up with, we were back there laughing at it. We're like, seriously? Grown ass men are imitating, a caricature, a made up figure in the movies. Really? Grown ass men? We couldn't believe it. But the women were going for it. And so it wasn't until I was much older and really understood things from a different perspective that I started to understand that the reason why those women were so taken with those figures was because they represented a rebellion against the system. That's what these figures represented. The Superfly and the Mac. They weren't a part of the system. They were against the system. They were fighting against the system. The system was after them, trying to bring them down. The man, as they called it back then, which I always thought was so silly. Why would you call a white man the man, as if you're not a man too? I never did get that one. That one totally went over my head. I thought it was about one of the stupidest things I'd ever heard, calling him the man. But anyway, women really fantasized about these guys. And so their thing was, this was somebody who represented power, rebellion against the system, and stacks and stacks of money. And bling bling. Of course, don't leave out the bling bling. And that's who they looked up to. That's what they wanted. Because they're like, I don't want a square. I don't want to sell out. I want somebody who's fly. And that got to be the thing back then. They wanted somebody who was fly. That stuck more than the Mac did, was the Superfly part. They wanted somebody who was fly. And that's what they got. Well, one of the things you have to look at is that doesn't represent anything that's cohesive about the black community, because these weren't family men. See, the factory workers, who a lot of black men were back then, because factory jobs were plentiful. My father had a factory job. Practically every black man on the street where I lived at had some type of factory job, because with a factory job, you could afford to get the house, the white picket fence, the dog, and have the kids and the whole nine, and the wife didn't have to work. They had great benefits. They had retirement plans that paid for life, not this 401k crap we got now. So that was huge during that time. But that wasn't fly. And so, but here's the thing, those were the fathers. Those were the men who were the leaders in the community that everybody called Mr. Jones and Mr. Smith. These people had respect because they carried themselves that way. And they didn't put up with no mess. And they were at home raising their children. There was no baby daddies scenarios. I mean, there's always been baby daddies, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't prevalent like it was back then. More women were married to those type of men. But the generation that I grew up in, they rejected that. They're like, no, I want somebody who's fly. Because they want somebody that, like I said, was rebellious, bling bling, and had stacks and swag. They didn't want somebody who was a 9-to-5er, who they considered to be born and square. They didn't want that. They rejected that. And not to mention the fact that those characters, Superfly and the Mac, Shaft also for that matter, none of them were married. And they all had multiple women. They all had side chicks. They usually had a main one, but they also had side chicks. So even that became the new norm. That was never the norm before, through those characters. Then you fast forward a little bit into the late 80s, early 90s, when rap really took over. And of course, styles changed. Superfly and Mac, all that died out. But now it was the rappers. Now it was the rap game. Now it was, idolizing those people. And they had a different type of bling and a different type of swag. But it's still the same thing. They were against the system. They were rebellious. And nobody would consider them a sellout. So the guy that went to school and got the degree and did it the right way, that was a sellout. That was a square. He was corny. So they didn't want him. And the Peel, through all that, made that possible, because before the Peel, women couldn't play those kind of games. And mistakenly, they taught us when we were in school, girls mature faster than boys. That's a lie. That's a lie. As far as their bodies are concerned, they may develop a little quicker. There were girls in my classroom that outgrew me at some point. They were a little taller and a little bit more, they were starting to fill out. That's true to a point, but mentally, no. No, it's not. And what happened was they were told that, they believed that, and so they decided, so that's what made them think that all the decisions that they made were mature decisions, where they weren't. They were making the same bad decisions that men were making, only they were women making them. And the Peel saved them a lot, because without the Peel, there'd have been a lot more pregnancies. But what the Peel did was, it allowed them to make the bad decisions to deal with guys that didn't mean them any good. So they could go after the Superflies and the Macs, and then later on the rapper type guys. They could go after them. And fast forward also to the rap scenario, that's when you get the Pookies and the Ray Rays that everybody likes to talk about now. Because they existed right alongside of the rappers. Some of them, they were the ones that TLC was talking about. I don't want no scrub. These are the ones that didn't make it, but they looked like the rappers. And they tried to have the swag. And they might have had a little fake bling bling. They might have went to the swap meet and had some jewelry or whatever. And some Jordans. So it just changed as far as the style was concerned, but the mentality did not change. And the Peel made allowances for that. So that way women could go out and get it's like Stella got a groove back. They could do that. They didn't have to wait till they got old either, but whether they got old or not, they get their groove back because of the pill, because they didn't have to worry about getting pregnant. And the only thing that really slowed it down, and this was past the time that I was saying, I didn't have to worry about that, thank God, because I was a total sex maniac. So I probably would have AIDS by now. But herpes and AIDS came along and slowed the game down, because now women had to worry about more than just getting pregnant. So now, whereas they weren't insisting on guys wearing condoms, now they had to wrap it extra tight, because that could mean getting a disease that would last you for the rest of your life, which is herpes, or death, which was AIDS. So that changed the game. That slowed everything down. But prior to that, it was wide open. It was wide open. Because women knew, and if they did have the child, if they did, because one thing about the pill, of course, it doesn't work when you don't take it. And a lot of women got to the place to where they couldn't take the pill anymore because their bodies wouldn't tolerate it, or it was a danger. I think cervical cancer is related to it, if I'm not mistaken, if for prolonged use. So if a girl got on the pill as a teenager, by the time she got to her mid-20s, her doctor would probably tell her it's time for you to come off that pill, because it's not safe for you to stay on it. So now they got the same sexual appetite. They don't have the pill anymore. So obviously you can see how that would work out. And as far as the condom is concerned, I mean, let's face it, most of us men, black men in particular, we don't like condoms. I don't like condoms. Most of us don't like condoms. It's a mood spoiler, for one thing. If you're trying to have spontaneous sex, a lot of times it's a hassle to stop and put the condom on. That's not an excuse. That's just the way it is for some people. Some people it don't matter. Some people it does. But that figures into the equation too. But the bottom line is, like I said before, the pill changed everything for women, and it affected the choices that they made. So my point is, I am not of the belief that, unlike what Kevin Samuels talks about 50 years ago, women are different, or however many years ago he brings up, I don't share that belief, because the difference also is not just some of the things that he talked about. I mean, everything has changed. There's a lot of things he didn't factor in. He didn't factor in food, as far as women being heavier now, thicker now than they were. Yeah, they are, but the food isn't what it was back when, the great grandparents were coming up either. They were eating real food. They weren't eating this processed crap that we've got now that's full of fructose and sucrose and you name it, that's putting all this weight on everybody, because it isn't just the women that's gotten bigger, the men have gotten bigger too. And I was really surprised that women let him get away with that. It isn't just the women who've gotten bigger, it's the men who've gotten bigger too. And it's the food, it's the quality of the food. It has everything to do with it. It isn't so much that we're not, because you look at all the gyms that have sprung up over the last, 30 years or so. You didn't even have gyms when there was no gym. The only gym we had when my father was working was the YWCA. Men could go to the Y and shoot ball or work out or whatever, but there weren't any of all these gyms. I mean, they had gyms for people that wanted to bodybuild, but gyms just for staying in shape, just so you won't be fat. No, those gyms didn't exist that many years ago, because nobody had that kind of weight issue. Regardless of what kind of work they did, they didn't have that kind of weight issue because the food was different. So you have to factor that in. But also, as far as character is concerned, I don't see where the character was any different. It was the options that were different. I'm a big believer that people do things according to their options. They move according to their options. And when women didn't have the pill to fall back on, when getting pregnant wasn't a good look and it wasn't a good option, to be pregnant and a single mother, because back at that time, it was taboo. During the time that he's talking about where women didn't do this and didn't do that, well, being a single mother was taboo back then. It's not anymore. Hasn't been for years. So you have to look at the option that those women had, or did not have rather, at that particular time, compared to the options that women have now. Also, the other factor was uh, women's jobs. If a woman got a job, she wasn't guaranteed to make the same salary as a man. Most of the times they didn't. One of the reasons why the feminist movement even started up in the first place was because there was so much inequality for women, especially in the workplace. So women could do the same type of work and still couldn't get paid the same amount of money, because the employer's mentality was, well, she's probably got a husband at home. This isn't, she's not the sole breadwinner. Whereas the man is the sole breadwinner, he's going to need more money because he's taking care of the whole family. So that was the mentality that they had. It wasn't so much about just being against women. They were looking at the practicality of it. So once women started becoming single mothers, and the feminist movement brought a lot of them around, because, you know, the white women, a lot of them decided to have children on their own and not have a man. And they could do that because, one thing, they had family support. They didn't have to go to welfare. If they hit a snag, they had family support most of the time. Or they might have a degree in something and had a really good job, really good salary, and they could maintain. But for black women, like I said before, when the white society gets a cold, black people get pneumonia, it didn't work out good for black women trying to be single mothers, because they didn't have that kind of income and they didn't have that kind of support system. So that's how that went. But as far as the character is concerned, no, it was about the options. Black women were acting on the options that they had that black women 50, 60 years ago didn't have. Or actually probably even longer ago than that. They didn't have those options because they weren't going to get a job making as much money as a man. And if they had kids, now they got to take care of themselves and their kids. And that wasn't feasible on the kind of money they could make. So they had a bigger reason to stay in that marriage, regardless of how bad that marriage was. And I think that is when he talks about women not staying, or finally coming to the point to where now they want the good guys, when they blew the chances to have all the good guys when they were younger. You know, my thing is, whenever you have an epiphany, it's never too late. At least you had one. There's people who will die and never get it. So at least they had one. Maybe it was late. Like I said, me and my wife didn't get together till we were 44. And we both know that we found each other at just the right point in time in our lives. So it can be done. But at the same time, like I said before, the options that women had at that particular time dictated what they did, more so than anything. And so I look at that more so than I look at the welfare issue, because true enough, when welfare came along, women knew that they could now maintain, if they had to, with the food stamps and WIC and the medical card and Section 8 and all that they could maintain without a man. And so obviously that took away from their motivation to try and make relationships work, because they could always decide, well, you know, I have this child by myself. I don't have to worry about the man's input. I don't have to worry about chasing them down for child support. If he pays child support, that's just more money, but I will still have a roof over my head. I will still have food. I will still have medical. And, you know, and in some cases, they even threw a little money for them to go back to school if they wanted to, or had some kind of allowance for somebody who would be watching the kids. Not a lot, but something. And so, yeah, those things were definitely factors as far as them making decisions to try and stick it out with the man. But as far as what brought about the children, you're talking about sex. You're not talking about welfare now. You're talking about sex. All that comes before welfare. The decision to have sex with somebody that you know you could get pregnant with. The women knew they could get pregnant, even with the birth control pill, because it's not 100%. And now you've got somebody that's gotten you pregnant. You're not married. All these things take place before welfare comes into the picture. And what they were relying on to keep from having to deal with any of that was the birth control pill or whatever form of birth control that they were happen to be using. If they weren't relying heavily on the pill, maybe they had the IUD or they had the foam. Everybody couldn't take the same thing sometimes. And of course, there was the old standby, the condom. But they definitely didn't rely on the rhythm method anymore. That's gone. That's obsolete in most cases. I don't even know if the Catholics still use it or not. They were relying on the pill. And again, the pill made it possible for them to make the choices to sleep with the Ray Rays and the Pookies, because if he was going to be gone tomorrow or a week from now or a month from now, what difference did it make? He was just a good feeling. They weren't looking for a good man. I've said that repeatedly. People who do that, they're not looking for, those women weren't looking for a good man. And the men who were with them weren't looking for a good woman. They were looking for good sex. It was never about, so to ask the question, well, why did you let so-and-so get, they weren't looking to get pregnant. They were looking for good sex. And pregnancy is a result of having sex. That's just natural biology. But that wasn't the intent. That wasn't the intent. And most of these women that he would have on the show, they would be too embarrassed to say that because they felt like if they admitted it, it would make them look like a hoe. But it's what it is. It is what it is. They weren't looking for good men. They were looking for good sex. And along the way of looking for good sex, they got pregnant. Because when you're going through the act of procreation, pregnancy can happen. I mean, that's the whole purpose of it, really. The purpose is, there's no animals that check into a motel to have sex. When animals hook up, they know, well, we're trying to have kids. We're trying to mate. We're trying to procreate. They know what they're doing. Humans are the only ones that use sex for recreational purposes. Let's be honest. We're the only ones that do that. Every other species on the planet has sex for procreation. And so, because that is the thing, because we do make it a sport, because we do make it a part of our entertainment, then people don't take it as seriously when they're doing it. They don't think about that. If you think you're, like me, for instance, this is how silly I was. So I'm definitely not talking about nobody. This is how stupid I was. My first wife had 2 miscarriages, and we were in our 20s at the time. And my other 2 brothers didn't have kids. And so without any going to the doctor and getting any testing done whatsoever, I just convinced myself that we probably couldn't have kids. Now, later on, my brother ended up with one that he didn't know was his. But even that didn't stop me. I'm still thinking, yeah, but there's probably something genetically wrong because, my first wife had 2 miscarriages. And so I was raw dogging. Through the whole thing. That's why I said, it's a wonder I didn't, if I didn't get myself together by the time AIDS and herpes rolled around, there's no telling where I'd be. And so when my son was born, I was 32 years old. And he wasn't planned, obviously, because I wasn't married to his mother. But I was just under the impression that I could just keep doing what I was doing and nothing would happen. Well, that was stupid. It was just downright stupid. There's no way around it. It was just downright stupid. There's no excuse for it. But that's how that happened. And so that's the same thing that's happened with a lot of other women. A lot of women have done the exact same thing. They've gone out here. They weren't looking for a good man. They were just looking for good sex. And because of the pill and other forms of birth control, they would do that. And then the one time they weren't protected, not the one time, but obviously the times that they got pregnant, when they weren't protected, that's when they got pregnant. And again, that's not an excuse, but that's the way that works. It just is. It's not any real big mystery. And so the other part of what I call the Kevin Samuels syndrome is what he's basically does with these women. What he was doing with them was, I call it pimpology 101. Because that's what pimps do. Pimps will tear a woman down who is full of self-esteem and kind of full of themselves, attitude or whatever. They'll break them down, regardless of how good looking they are. And if you notice, a lot of the women that Kevin Samuels had on the show were good looking women when he would show them, when he would put them on the split screen. A lot of times they were good looking women, and he broke them down. That's what a pimp does. Break you down and then build you up to their standards. That's what a pimp does. That's Pimpology 101. So a lot of these women did have every good reason to feel the way they did about themselves. As far as high value men not wanting those women, yeah, maybe. That could be the case. I've seen strange couples in my lifetime. I've seen people that you would put other people with and you would be like, how in the world did they ever get together? What in the hell was he thinking? What in the hell was she thinking? We've all seen that 1,000,000 times. I know I ain't the only one. We've all seen that. So to say that somebody can't do something, that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. What it is that he was trying to set it up to where men like him could have women who were super hot, who were young and super hot, that would be fit, feminine, submissive for him and his group, so that they could have this buffet of women to choose from. If they got them all in line, then that's just more women for him and his group. Because he already said, if somebody wasn't a high value man, that they can expect to get a woman like that. That they had to expect to get whatever their income basically would allow. Their options were limited by their income. So, but yet at the same time, he said the high value man, he said, we don't cheat. We just exercise our options. That's Pimpology 101 all day long. That's all that was. I'm sorry. That's really all that really is. That's that pimp mentality. That's that pimp program. To tear those women down and then build them back up to his standards. Because if they go along with it, that makes them easier to deal with for somebody like him. When he talked about, we don't care about your education, we don't care about your income, men don't care about that. Well, of course not. Not the kind of man that he is, and his constituents that would be in his income bracket. No, they don't care about that because they can take care of a woman. They don't have to have the woman's help financially to take care of business. And so, yeah, they have no use for a woman that's educated because her education is only going to make her more competitive with him. It means it's going to be harder for him to win an argument and harder for him to get her to stay home and play the submissive role if she's got goals and dreams too, and she doesn't want to just be in his shadow or just be known as just being his wife. No. And it isn't as if he was going to marry, if all those women that are in that category are going to get married either, but they make better side chicks. If they're looking at somebody like him thinking, oh, if I play my cards right, he might marry me one day. And then I hit the jackpot. Now, we men know you couldn't get a better side chick than somebody who's waiting and waiting in the wings, just waiting for the day when, all their fantasies are going to come true. In the meantime, you get all the gravy. And guess what? If that doesn't happen, you're on to the next one. I mean, that's just the way that works. I'm sorry. It is. And a lot of women know that because they've been there. That's the reason why he couldn't talk crazy to all of them. Because they like, no, I know better. I've been there. And that's just the way it is. But, aside from that, hey, he was right about what he was right about. There were a lot of women who are attitudinal, who wouldn't make a good wife. They have all the wrong ideas about what a man is. They have no clue about what a man thinks, what a man wants. He was right on a lot of stuff. I mean, I found, there was very little that I could ever disagree with him about as far as the things that he brought up. But again, that was Pimpology 101. It just was. It just was. Because, the fact that he dealt with younger women, and admittedly so, and died with one when he died, yeah. Of course he wanted women like that to be fit, feminine, submissive, and looking for a husband. Because that makes them the best girlfriend or side chick you could ever have. Couldn't ask for a better one. Whereas if they are the type that, well, let's put it this way, and why I call this Pimpology 101, I've not known pimps to hang around colleges. I've not known pimps to hang around college dorms. Now, that's not to say they never do, because somebody will come back and say, oh, yeah, I know somebody who did, and, this, that, and the third. But mostly they don't. Mostly they deal with women who just got off the Greyhound, ain't got no family, ain't got a clue, don't know nothing. What was that? If anybody ever saw the movie Foxy Brown, Samuel Jackson had that woman that was at one of his spots that was, some young black girl that was just totally clueless. And he told, I think Robert De Niro, one of them, he said, this dumb heifer thinks she is in Hollywood. That's the one that they pick on. That's the one that they go after, because it's much easier to get them on their program than it would be for somebody who's educated, who's intelligent, who's connected. They're not going to be able to pull that on them because it's going to be too much work, way too much work. And they don't have time for that. That part he was telling the truth about. Somebody that's putting in the kind of hours that he puts in, they don't have that kind of time to deal with somebody to put in that kind of work. So it's much easier to deal with somebody who would just say yes. Oh, I didn't know. I'm so glad you told me. You mean I can do that? Oh, wow. Can you show me how to do it? It's much easier to deal with somebody like that than it is somebody who's going to question your every move, that's going to question why you did what you did. What is it you're trying to do exactly? Isn't going to fall for you, whatever little weak excuse you're going to use for not coming home, so that he can, as he said, exercise his options. It's a lot harder to exercise your options with somebody that's going to be down your back because they know the game and they know your line and they know you ain't working late. They know you didn't go on a business trip by yourself. Yeah, this is Pimpology 101. Trust me, that's all it was. So anyway, I don't want to make this one any longer because, I didn't want to make several different parts. I was trying to get it all wrapped up in one. But I will be back with another series later. Bye until now. Till then.